In the 53 years since the birth of the national flag of Canada, it's become one of the most recognized and well-respected symbols in the world. So what happened in the 1960s that influenced the government of Canada's decision to have our own symbol? After all, we had been using a borrowed ensign for nearly 100 years. We hope you can join us on this journey as your host Robert J. Harper, founder and executive director of the Canada Flag Education Centre, unravels the details of a promise and how our maple flag became the national flag of Canada. Hopefully, in future episodes, we'll dive even deeper into the details, from 1867 all the way to the present.
From my youngest years, almost 7 years old, when I first met Mr. Matheson, I always had a fascination of his work in Canada as our Member of Parliament, as a lawyer, as a judge, as an overseas veteran, and as a friend of my father's. I was able to communicate with him on many different subjects and had the opportunity to get to know the story of how we got our flag. And Mr. Matheson had walked up our driveway with the use of walking sticks, and he was wearing a chest full of military medals. And he told me he was there to ask my mom for her vote because he was running as a candidate for an upcoming election to become the Member of Parliament for Leeds County. The election was held on the 29th of May, 1961. Mr. Matheson became our Liberal Member of Parliament in that by-election. Immediately, he went off to Ottawa and began a career in politics. In 1982, I met Mr. Matheson again in Westport, Ontario. I was the manager of the arenas and the parks in Westport. And in 1982, there was a celebration for the 150th anniversary of the Rideau Canal system. Mr. Matheson was present. He was there with the Governor General of the day. We talked about the fact that most Canadians did not know the story of how we got the flag. They only knew about the flag debate, which was the most vicious and divisive debate in parliamentary history of Canada. If you mention the Canadian flag, the first thing they talk about is the debate and how nasty and how divided our country was about it. There are still people today in 2018 that hate the Canadian Maple Leaf flag. They would want to see the red ensign flying forever. I believe that everyone has the right to have their opinion. The truth is, the flag that we have today, that first flew on Parliament Hill in 1965, was a symbol and is a symbol of unity that is respected in the world today. And Mr. Matheson, Mr. Pearson, and the group that worked to make sure that we got that flag should be honored and credited with the work that was done. There are still people today that believe there was one person responsible for the design and creation and suggestion of the Canadian Maple Leaf flag. That person was Dr. George Stanley from RMC. The truth of the matter is there were many, many loving hands, as Mr. Matheson would say, that participated and contributed. This is exactly the story of a promise that was made by Lester B. Pearson to himself and to the country that we would have our own symbol. That promise was then given to Mr. Matheson to do the work to bring it forward. And Mr. Matheson promised Mr. Pearson that he would fulfill the promise that Mr. Pearson had made to himself and to our country. This all began in 1956. Prior to Mr. Matheson and Mr. Pearson, the flag debate actually started in 1867. And I know that's a long time ago. I know lots of people have no interest in how far back the discussion goes. But the reality is our fathers of Confederation, who we all admire and honor, overlooked one little problem. They forgot about a flag. And in 1867, when Canada became a country, we didn't have a flag. Sounds odd. Sounds almost unbelievable, but it's true. We didn't have a flag. So in 1871, we actually borrowed a flag. It really wasn't a flag, it was an ensign. And it was called the Red Ensign. And that ensign had been designed to be flown on maritime vessels. It would indicate that the vessel was recognized as part of the British Commonwealth. That's the flag that we as a country used up to 1965. Mr. Pearson worked as Secretary of State, as a diplomat, and he brought together a peace accord for the Suez Canal crisis. And in his effort to put that together, he offered Canadian troops to be frontline peacekeepers, only to have that offer rejected bluntly because Canadian soldiers wore the red ensign on their shoulder and could be mistaken for British soldiers. Mr. Pearson was devastated. He promised himself at that time that if he ever had the opportunity and the wherewithal, that he would ensure Canada had its very own symbol. So in 1958, Mr. Pearson became the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. He made a promise to his party that they would work to establish the groundwork for what it would take to have a national flag for Canada. And that groundwork started with a policy adaptation in 1960. By the time Mr. Matheson was elected to Parliament on May 29, 1961, the Liberal Party of Canada were planning groundwork for a national flag of Canada when they became government. What took place from 1961 through 65 are the details of who and how the flag was brought to fruition. But to understand how that happened, we would have to go all the way back to approximately 1895, when a gentleman from Toronto, a lawyer, his name was Edward M. Chadwick. He had for many years written to the government of Canada suggesting that we have our very own flag. And his concentration on that flag as a symbol was that it had to have a maple leaf, because the maple leaf was a symbol that had been part of Canadian history dating back to the 1600s. So Mr. Chadwick was the first on record to suggest that we have our flag and that it have a maple leaf. And that was in 1895, 1896. During that period of time, the government of Canada looked at and reviewed Mr. Chadwick's suggestions, as well as suggestions from other heraldry experts, and they decided the subject matter was too divisive and too controversial to move forward. So the idea of our symbol was put on the back burner, and it was not until a committee was struck in approximately 1918 that were looking at the crest of Canada and the symbols of Canada, and the armorial bearing of Canada was a group of heraldic symbols that was used as a formal crest or insignia of Canada. It was discovered that it was very complicated, not easy to reproduce, so the government of the day sent out messages to some of their people that worked in militia and heraldry and said, what can we do? One of those people, he was the Undersecretary of Militia and Defense, and his name was Thomas Mulvoy. Thomas Mulvoy was interested in heraldry, in flags, in insignias, and he had a gentleman working for him, and his name was Major General, later Sir Eugene Fazette. The input that Fazette sent to his boss, Mr. Mulvoy, in a form of a memo dated February the 4th, 1919, stipulated that his belief was that our symbol should be a single red maple leaf on a white field with two red borders. If that sounds familiar, Guess what? That's what we got. It just took 46 years to have that suggestion brought forward again by others. As you know, we were in the First World War. We were at war until 1918. From that period of time, the suggestions were bantered back and forth of what the armorial bearing would be, not only our symbol, but the armorial bearing. After all of that report was put in front of a committee, so there was a recommendation that certain parts of the crest and the armorial bearing be developed, and the government of Canada asked King George V to look at what they had recommended. So in 1921, King George proclaimed that Canada's official colors should be red and white, and the armorial bearing be addressed as a 3 co-joined maple leaf insignia. That all took place up till 1921. Then in 1925, because of the changes to the armorial bearing and the official colors being proclaimed, heraldry enthusiasts and government officials asked the government of the day if they would look at developing a symbol. So the government of the day called for proposals from the public, and they had literally thousands of people suggested different things about having a symbol. There were fishes, there were things that looked like like the Star Spangled Banner. There were things that had the fleur de lis. There were many different styles, and they're well documented that people can actually see the recommendations from back then. So the government of the day, Mackenzie King, decided it was too controversial, so he passed and said, no, we don't need it. We have the ensign, we'll deal with that. Well, in 1939, the war broke out, the Second World War broke out, and all of the militia, all of the heraldry, all of the symbols and that type of stuff were put on the back burner while we fought the war. After 1945, in 1946, there was a committee struck again because we had this issue that we didn't have our own symbol. We were fighting under the British ensign. And there were many people that felt Canada wasn't represented as having a symbol. With the work that we'd done in the war and the fighting prowess that we had wasn't recognized by Canada. It was rather recognized as being a British subject. So it was again brought to the forefront in 46. And that committee was struck by, again, Mackenzie King. And he put a gentleman in charge, Paul Martin Sr. Paul Martin Sr. was the father of Paul Martin Jr., who became the Prime Minister of Canada. So Paul Martin Sr. had laid some groundwork. Again, there was controversy, there was a call for suggestions, and the government of the day felt it was too controversial. So it was put on the back burner again. And it was not until 1956 when Lester Pearson brokered the peace deal for the Suez Canal, and he was bluntly rejected as having Canadian peacekeepers. That promise that we would have our very own national symbol for Canada began.
So I have a pretty good question I think you can answer. What does the Canadian flag mean to you?
Wow. I believe, for me, that the maple leaf flag is a symbol of unity, respect, admiration, and at the same time, it has this inner quality that was brought forward by our people. And the one thing that Mr. Matheson emphasized over and over again was our flag, the symbol of Canada, was brought forward without one drop of blood. We have one of the most respected symbols in the world, and we got it by the parliamentary process. People should know, every Canadian should know the details of how we got that flag, because it is super special. It is incredibly Canadian in the way that it was developed. Other countries fight battles. Other countries have civil wars. Other countries have massive death and injury to achieve what Canada did through a parliamentary process.